War and violence have always been a part of our history. As humans, we turn to violence for different reasons. Some do it for revenge, some do it to gain territory, and others do it for political or religious reasons. But there are also people that try to get economic gains out of it. While the term organized crime first came into use in the USA among the members of the Chicago Crime Commission, it is a phenomenon that dates back for centuries. From ransacking pirates to bootlegging gangsters back in the days, to money laundering mobsters, kill-thirsty cartels and organized cyber-hacking groups in the present time. Today, we will talk about one of these groups. They are called the Yakuza. Welcome to the Glimp. The Yakuza are a at least 400-year-old criminal syndicate with samurai-like rituals that carries out everything from human trafficking to real estate sales. They are also called Burakumin, meaning violence groups, or Gakudo, meaning the extreme path. They are Japanese gangsters or Mafia-like criminal organizations, consisting of takiya and bakudo, peddlers and gamblers. The takiya were common street peddlers and some of the lowest-ranking members of Japanese society. In the 17th century they became a very structured group, with the boss, known as the oyabun, at the top, and the gang members, known as kabun, at the bottom. Bakudo, the gamblers, had a much lower social standing, as gambling was illegal. Society at large regarded the gambling houses they worked from. Much of the undesirable image of the Yakuza originates from Bakudo. This includes the name Yakuza itself. The word Yakuza itself, meaning good for nothing, is believed to have derived from a worthless hand in a Japanese card game called oichokobo, which is a similar game to blackjack. The cards, ya, ku and sa, meaning 8, 9 and 3, when added up, give the worst possible total in the game. The beginnings. To go back to the beginnings of the Yakuza, we have to go back to the feudal times, where the history of this gang begins with class. The first members of Yakuza were part of a social caste, called the Burakumin, considered to be the lowest people of humanity, a group so far below the rest of society that they couldn't even touch other humans. The Burakumin were those who worked with death, for instance undertakers, executioners, butchers and leather workers. In Buddhist and Shinto society, this was considered to be unclean. The isolation of the Burakumin. In the 11th century the forced isolation of the Burakumin had started, but it got a lot worse in the year 1603. This is the year that laws were written to cast them out of society. They were denied getting an education, and many of the members were sent out of the cities, forcing them to live in secluded societies. Nowadays there are still lists being passed around the country that name the descendants of the Burakumin that are used to prevent them from getting certain jobs or positions. The names on these lists are still estimated to make up more than half of the Yakuza. Despite the limited amount of options available, the sons of the Burakumin had to find ways to survive. They had two options: carrying on their parents' legacies by working with the dead and ostracizing themselves further from society, or turn to crime. This is the reason crime flourished after 1603. Illegal shops selling stolen goods started cropping up in and around Japan. Other members set up illegal gambling houses in abandoned places such as temples and shrines. Soon after they started setting up their organized gangs, guarding illegal shops or gambling locations, keeping them protected in exchange for money or other resources. This is when the first Yakuza were born. During the formation of this gang, they adopted a lot of the traditional Japanese hierarchical structures. In a later period, the code of Jinji, meaning justice and duty, was developed where loyalty and respect are a way of life, and respect they would get. The leaders of the Yakuza were officially recognized by Japan's rulers. They were given the honor of having surnames, which wasn't allowed before. Also were they now allowed to carry swords. They were granted the same honors as nobility. As odd as it is, turning to crime had given the members of the Burakumin their first signs of respect. And because of this, of course, it didn't take long before they were a full-blown group of criminal organizations. At some point, a lot of non-Japanese people such as Koreans and Chinese also started to join the gang, as most of the times they were from a lower socioeconomic status already. They had an initial connection with the Burakumin people. At their peak in the early 60s, police estimated that the Yakuza had a membership of more than 200,000. The Code of the Yakuza. Members are starting to live according to strict codes of loyalty, obedience and silence. Codes that are still active nowadays. With these strict codes, the Yakuza became more than just a gang. It was more like a family. As a new member, you had to accept your boss as your new father. With a little ceremony known as sakazuki, consisting of sharing a glass of sake, a traditional Japanese drink, you would accept the Yakuza as your new home. Unfortunately, sometimes this meant you had to cut ties with your biological family. For some people this was appealing, as they had no connections in any part of the normal society. To them, it meant finding like-minded people you could call your brothers. The appearance of the Yakuza. Members of the Yakuza are usually portrayed wearing fundoshi, sometimes with a kimono, or, in more recent years, a Western-style suit. To show their loyalty, they would often change their appearance. Members cover themselves in complex, meaningful tattoos, in a style known as irizumi. This style of tattooing was done with a sharpened piece of bamboo or steel. This was a painful, slow process. Most of their bodies were covered with these tattoos. Sometimes it even included their private parts. Eventually it became forbidden for the Yakuza to show off their tattoos, but still, it wasn't hard to spot a member. There was another way you could spot a Yakuza member: the missing finger on their left hand. This was the most common punishment for disloyalty, also known as yubitsume. After being disloyal, you would be forced to cut your left pinky and hand it over to your father, the boss. This actually was not only for punishment but also had a practical purpose. Cutting off your left hand pinky would weaken your sword grip, and thus you would be more reliant on the protection of the Yakuza. When the members play the Oichokubo cards game together, they often remove their clothes or open them up and drape them around their waists, enabling to display their full-body tattoos to each other. This is one of the few times that the members display their tattoos, as in day-to-day life they keep them concealed. Illegal business. The Yakuza have always been involved in small-time crimes such as drug dealing, prostitution and extortion. Especially important was, and still is, the drug trade. Nowadays most of the drugs in Japan still is imported by the Yakuza. The types of these drugs include methamphetamines, marijuana, MDMA, ketamine and other goods they think the people will buy. One sure way of making money is dealing drugs. The one thing you can't get a hold of without underworld connections, a thing Yakuza members accelerate in. Besides trafficking drugs, they also traffic women. Traveling to remote villages in places such as Eastern Europe, the Philippines and South America to lure young girls back to Japan by promising them great jobs and lucrative careers. Upon arrival they would find out they are trapped in a foreign country without sufficient money to get back home. All they are left with is a gangster they have been set up with, pushing them into a life of prostitution. These prostitutes most of the times are operating from karaoke bars, massage saloons, clubs, or love hotels that aren't owned by the gang members themselves. This was so that they have a person who will take the fall if the location gets busted. One of the largest sources of Yakuza members is Kyushu Island. It housed many bosses of the group, mainly in Fukuoka, the northernmost part of the island, where the big bosses of two of the most powerful clans originated from. Expanding the empire. For a long time the Yakuza have been tolerated. They were useful criminals. Sometimes even the government took advantage of their positions and skills. From military operations to bodyguarding important figures. Because of this, members saw themselves as businessmen rather than hardened criminals. In the 1980s, the Yakuza started sending their enforcers to work for real estate agents. These members were called the jff. The agents would hire them if they wanted to demolish a residential area for new projects, but they couldn't get landowners out. To make them leave, they would pressure the people until they moved out. In one example, the contents of an entire septic tank were thrown through a window. The Yakuza did the dirty work for the real estate agents, and the surprising part about it is that the government allowed it. Even the government itself has been caught hiring the gang to force people out of their residence. Soon after getting into real estate, they moved into the business world. They would send their men to stockholder meetings, and there they would blackmail companies into doing whatever they needed them to do. But there were also a lot of companies that were accepting the Yakuza with open arms. When the banks couldn't offer massive loans, the Yakuza stepped in. They had no problem doing this. The only thing they wanted in exchange was a stake in a legitimate company. At the peak, as much as 50 companies were listed on the Osaka Security Exchange that had deep ties to the gang. The gangsters learned that legitimate business was even more profitable than crime. The downfall of the Yakuza. As they became more and more used to the ways of legitimate business, the days of violence were fading away. Yakuza-related murders were cut in half in a few years. Now it had turned into a semi-legal business, and the government hated it more than ever. To do something about this, they started passing so-called anti-Yakuza laws. The first of these laws was passed in 1991. This law stipulated that now it was illegal for any Japanese gangster to get involved in legitimate business. Since that moment, more and more anti-Yakuza laws have been passed. They couldn't move their money they used to anymore, and the government was even petitioning to other countries to freeze Yakuza assets. At this moment, the gang was rapidly shrinking in size, not only because of arrests, but also because with most of their assets frozen, they didn't have enough money to pay the wages of their members. Changing the reputation. Since then, the Yakuza have forcefully changed their ways. They are helping citizens and being generous. They are trying to position themselves to gain contracts for their construction companies for a massive rebuilding that some experts claim is coming. Some of them think it is all a facade. If they help out the regular citizens, it's hard for the government or police to say anything bad about them, journalist Tomohiko Suzuki said. The ways they help people aren't always the most ethical ways. For instance, when they send help to the Fukushima reactor when disaster had struck, they send the homeless people and people who owed them money. A lot of people got tricked into helping out. But the gang insists that they are honoring their history and that they are just helping out. Because they know what it's like to be abandoned. They are just using the resources they have to make things better. Some people claim they have a positive effect on society, for instance by stopping other criminal organizations from acting in their areas of operation. However, in general, the use of violence as a tool has caused their approval to fall with the general public. Nowadays there are still around 12,000 active known Yakuza members, although it might be possible that there are a lot more than the statistics say. At this time, more than half of today's members are over 50, with 10% over the age of 70. The impact Yakuza made is still very visible throughout Japan. Movies, series, and books are written about them, romanticizing them by being respected businessmen, or portraying them as cruel monsters who use fear and violence to get things done. If you enjoyed this documentary, Please let us know in the comments what you think of it,